Hey there, welcome to my channel. Today's big question, how does natural gas reach the grotto beneath the falls? I'm your host. You may know me from my other videos in which I don't get my hands dirty actually getting answers to questions that have been submitted by viewers like yourself. But today is different because I'm going to get my hands dirty literally. As you can see, we are at the bottom of a waterfall. And today we are going to try and figure out how natural gas might be reaching this grotto. I'm down here with two people. One person filmed this video from above so we could see what it looks like. And another person has been investigating this for years. I'll introduce him properly later on. So there's a few things you might be wondering. How do we even get down here? Well, we climb down with ropes. There are some fixed anchors in place that make it a lot easier than if we were to free climb it. There's also a ladder which is used to access a ledge about halfway up. And then from that ledge, there's a couple more fixed pitches to the bottom. So, it's not super difficult. But it takes a little bit of time and effort to get down here. The second thing you might be wondering is why is it so dry down here? There's definitely some water dripping off the ceiling, but it doesn't seem like it should be dry. It definitely wasn't when we were here a few weeks ago. Well, this grotto has a really unique feature that allows the ceiling to stay dry even though it is right below a waterfall. If you look over here, there's an opening in the back of the cave. That opening allows air to flow into this cave, and since hot air rises, the hot air that is rising from the depths of the earth carries with it all of the moisture from the surrounding rocks. And therefore, there's less moisture available to actually drip down onto the ceiling. Now, sometimes this cave gets pretty humid, so it will still drip, but most of the time this cave stays relatively dry, which is pretty wild considering that we're right underneath a waterfall. Alright, so now let's talk about the main event. How is it that this grotto has such good air quality that it is suitable for some very special creatures that we are gonna be seeing later on? And how is it that these creatures use this grotto and the waterfall above it in order to obtain food? Well, those are great questions. And before we get to the answer, let us take a quick moment to appreciate the amazing work of our cameraman who is braving some pretty wet conditions up top to capture this beautiful footage. There's actually a bit of a legend that surrounds this place, and it goes something like this. Long ago, there was a giant who lived on the mountain across the valley from us. This giant would come down to this valley and eat all of the crops of the poor farmers. The farmers were tired of this, so they went to the chief and asked for help. The chief said, "I will give you 300 gold coins if somebody can kill that giant." No one was willing to do it until finally one young man stepped forward and said, "I will do it." He climbed to the top of the mountain where the giant lived and threw a rock down the mountain. He yelled, "Beware, ye who enter here," and the rock hit the giant on the head, knocking him unconscious. Then he took his knife and carved out a piece of the mountain that made a loud noise when air passed through it. He installed that piece of rock as the new top of the mountain. And whenever the giant awoke and tried to restore the mountain, it would make a loud noise, causing the giant to fall back asleep. That rock is what we now call Mount Arrogant. And the noise that he carved out is what we now call the waterfall. Now, whether or not that legend is true is anybody's guess. But there's evidence that suggests that people have been coming to this place for quite some time. There's petroglyphs all around the base of the mountain. And it turns out that the oldest of these petroglyphs are between 500 and 2,000 years old. But despite the fact that people have been coming here for thousands of years, this place remained unknown to most of the modern world until just a few decades ago. In the early 1960s, a biologist named Takeo Isaki came here in search of salamanders. He had heard reports of strange creatures living in caves, and so he came to investigate. What he found was something even stranger, though. He found a colony of what are known today as the grotto fairy shrimp. These fairy shrimp live their entire lives underwater, but breathe atmospheric oxygen rather than dissolved oxygen. Basically, they need bubbles to breathe. In order to survive, they burrow in the mud during the day, and at night they come out to hunt for bacteria. And they've developed the ability to convert toxic hydrogen sulfide into energy. So they have a pretty unique lifestyle that allows them to live in very few places on Earth. And this grotto is one of those special places. But the real mystery is, how do they get the oxygen they need to survive? Well, you only have to look around this grotto for a few seconds to find the answer. Look up there, do you see it? Yeah, that's a bubble. There's actually a whole bunch of bubbles coming out of the rock here. And it turns out that these bubbles are the key to everything. Not only do these bubbles carry oxygen that the shrimp need in order to survive, but they also carry methane, which the shrimp use in order to produce carbon dioxide, which then creates the perfect environment for algae to grow, which the shrimp eat. So basically, these bubbles provide everything the shrimp need in order to survive. But there's still a big question that remains. How are these bubbles created? Well, the answer to that question can be found right here. Remember that unique feature that this cave has, the opening in the back? Well, it turns out that this opening is a natural gas vent. The same natural gas that heats our homes and powers our cars comes from vents like this, except usually it doesn't come out of the side of a mountain. Instead, it comes out of the ground in places called seeps. But the principle is the same. Natural gas is less dense than the surrounding rock, and therefore it rises upwards. As it rises, it encounters water, and the water reacts with the gas and forms pockets of methane. This methane then dissolves into the water, creating bubbles, which eventually float to the surface. When the bubbles reach the surface, the water evaporates and leaves behind only the gas. And that's when the bubbles become visible. Now, in most cases, this natural gas would just dissipate into the atmosphere. But in this case, the wind blows it directly into this cave, creating a perfect environment for life to thrive. That means that this vent, this cave, this waterfall, and this mountain are all connected by this network of underground pipes. And that makes me wonder what else might be connected to this system. Are there even bigger systems that connect different parts of the mountain? Do these systems exist elsewhere? I think that there's still a lot that we don't know about the world, and I hope that maybe one day we'll be able to understand it better. And now it's time to answer the remaining question. How do the shrimp use the gas that comes from the bubbles? Well, first of all, it's important to note that the shrimp don't actually eat the gas itself. Instead, the gas provides the perfect environment for algae to grow, and the shrimp eat the algae. You see, the shrimp live in a world without light, so they can't photosynthesize themselves. And that's why they rely on the algae that do photosynthesize so that they can eat the algae and get the energy they need. Now, the reason that this grotto has such great air quality is because of all of the methane that is being pumped in from the vent. Methane is toxic to most animals, but the shrimp have evolved a way to survive in its presence. They essentially use the methane as a food source. And that's why they are only found in places like this where there is lots of methane available. So, I want to thank everybody who helped make this video possible. First of all, I want to thank our cameraman Matt for capturing this amazing footage. And I also want to thank one of our patrons for bringing me here and introducing me to this amazing place. Also, I want to give a huge shout out to the owner of the land for allowing us to film here. And I want to give a big thank you to everybody who makes these videos possible with their monthly support. If you like this video, please consider supporting us. And as always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. In my last video, I talked about how we know that shale gas is formed by hot water cracking methane out of the rocks. The reason we know this is because if it were, then when we drill deep enough to access these supposedly hot waters, we should see temperatures consistent with those required for such cracking to occur. But what we find instead are temperatures far lower than necessary. In fact, based on all the data collected from wells all over the place, I concluded that not only is it unlikely that there are any areas where temperatures are high enough to crack methane out of the rock, but also that in many areas, temperatures are actually too low to even allow for the migration of methane out of the rock in the first place. But there are still some people who believe that the hot shale gas theory is correct. So let's look at the evidence they use to support their position. Before we begin, I'd like to say that I don't hate anyone who believes in this hot shale gas theory. They're just misguided. They have bad information, and they draw conclusions based on incorrect premises. So this video isn't about hating people. It's about understanding why their beliefs aren't correct. Okay, so here's the first piece of evidence they use. This figure comes from a paper published in 2014 by Nicholas Styron and his co-authors. This paper was published in the prestigious journal Nature and is titled Methane Release from Subduction Zones Shapes Global Carbon Dioxide Levels. And here's the abstract. Global atmospheric methane levels are controlled by the balance between sources and sinks. Here we present a mechanism that may have major implications for understanding the present and future budgets of methane. We show that fluids released from the cold burial of organic matter at subduction zones contribute significantly to present-day methane levels. So before we even get into the actual data in this graph, just look at the title of the paper and the abstract. Does this look like a paper that's going to be talking about temperatures deep underground? No, it doesn't. It's talking about the burial of organic matter at subduction zones. That's a geological term for where one tectonic plate collides with another and pushes it under the surface of the Earth. So again, this looks like a paper about shallow burial, not deep underground stuff. However, if you read through the paper, you'll notice that they do talk about the temperature gradient in the Earth, which is the change in temperature with depth. In fact, here's the actual section that talks about it. The effect of fluid exsolution on effective porosity is included in our model as an additional parameter beta, which describes the effect of pressure and temperature on gas solubility in the pore fluid. We assume that the temperature varies linearly with depth following a geothermal gradient of 25 degrees C per kilometer. For simplicity, we assume that the geothermal gradient is constant and that the temperature does not vary laterally. So they do assume a geothermal gradient of 25 degrees C per kilometer, but that's shallow. That's like less than 1 kilometer deep. You start getting into what's considered deep at about 3 kilometers. And anything below 6 kilometers, it's really deep. So again, this paper is not about deep underground temperatures. And also remember that temperature isn't the only thing that affects the solubility of gases in water. There's also pressure. And the deeper you go underground, the more the weight of the rock above compresses the water and increases the pressure. And increased pressure actually increases the ability of the water to hold onto gases. So if we were to plot the depth versus the ability of the water to hold onto gases, it wouldn't just be a simple decline with increasing depth due to higher temperatures. There would also be an increase in the ability of the water to hold onto gases due to increasing pressure. So even if these authors did think they had proof of hot shale gas, they don't, because their own assumptions about the way temperature and pressure affect gas solubility mean that there would be a large region where gas can't migrate out of the rock. The next piece of evidence people use is this study from 2018 by Gebhardt and his co-authors. The title is High Temperatures in the Wolfcampian Black Shale of the Appalachian Basin Constrained by Fluid Inclusions in Quartz. Now this looks promising. They're talking about temperatures in the Wolfcamp, which is the specific rock formation that a lot of the US shale gas is found in. And they're talking about it in the context of fluid inclusions in quartz. Fluid inclusions are basically where you have a little bit of water trapped inside a quartz crystal. The problem with using fluid inclusions to determine past temperatures is that it is very difficult to prove that the temperature recorded in the fluid inclusion is actually from the formation of the shale and not from some other later event. Here's the relevant section from the paper. The fluid inclusions studied here have homogenized at temperatures ranging from 90 to 240 degrees C, which provides a minimum estimate for the temperatures experienced during burial and exhumation of the black shale. These high temperatures imply that the thermal maturity of the Wolfcampian black shale is higher than previously reported, and that its depositional environment was hotter than previously envisioned. So the authors make two claims here. First is that the temperature experienced by these rocks was at least 240 degrees Celsius. And second is that the depositional environment was hotter than previously envisioned. Both of these claims are misleading. Let's start with the first one. Their entire argument for 240-degree temperatures rests on the assumption that all of these fluid inclusions formed at the same time as the shale was forming. If that were true, then yeah, sure, we could use them to estimate the temperature. But here's the problem. It's extremely common for fluid inclusions in quartz to form late in the history of the quartz, long after the main event that caused the quartz to form. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that this is what happened here. First off, there are multiple generations of fluid inclusions in these samples. Here's the quote from the paper. Primary fluid inclusions are planar and display good two-phase liquid plus vapor behavior. Secondary fluid inclusions are mostly irregular in shape and commonly exhibit decrepitation. Primary inclusions are considered to have trapped original fluids present during quartz crystallization, whereas secondary inclusions are considered to have formed during a later stage of fluid rock interaction. Secondly, if we look at the graph of their results, you can see that most of the fluid inclusions fall along this line, which represents homogenization due to cooling. This tells us that most of these fluid inclusions didn't form at 240 degrees. Instead, they formed at much lower temperatures, and then the quartz cooled down to these temperatures after the fluid inclusion formed. Now, okay, let's just ignore that part about 240-degree temperatures because it's just wrong. But what about the claim that the depositional environment was hotter than previously envisioned? Well, here's the problem. To use this graph to make that argument, they've mislabeled it. This isn't a graph of temperature versus time. It's a graph of temperature versus burial depth. And since temperature increases with depth, this curve tells us nothing about the temperature of the depositional environment. It just tells us that these rocks were buried deeper than previously thought. So to summarize, both of these studies try to argue that the hot water theory is correct. But they both fail because they are based on incorrect assumptions about how temperature and pressure affect pH, solubility of gases in water. Now, in my last video, I showed you this graph that shows the amount of methane released per ton of rock versus the amount of vitrinite reflectance. Vitrinite reflectance is an indicator of the maximum temperature that the rock has ever experienced. So this graph is showing that no matter how high the temperature gets, the amount of methane released per ton of rock never gets that high. If the hot shale gas theory were true, then this graph would look very different. We would expect the amount of methane released per ton of rock to increase with temperature all the way up to, let's say, 300 degrees or maybe 400 degrees. Now, there are some people who argue that this graph doesn't apply at high temperatures because it is only based on data from a few specific locations, like Pennsylvania and Ohio. So, I went out and found some more data to add to the graph. I got the data from a variety of sources, including some papers, and I'm pretty sure it's accurate. I am not 100% sure because sometimes it is hard to tell exactly what they were doing to get these numbers, but I tried my best. I then plotted the new data points on the graph and here's what we get. Now there's a lot more data points and look at the trend. At low temperatures, the amount of methane released per ton of rock increases with temperature. This is expected. But once we get to around 175 degrees or so, the trend reverses and the amount of methane released per ton of rock starts to decrease. And at 250 degrees, it's almost zero. And if we were to plot the upper limit of the range instead of the average value, then at 250 degrees, it would be completely flat. So yeah, the hot shale gas theory is wrong. Thanks for watching.